Hello there and welcome to the new video of applying wet on wet primer followed by base and clear. When you get a brand new panel you would generally have it in a brown transport cardboard. First thing you need to do is check for any damage. And you can see I've got the camera in such a way where I can see the reflection, and I'm checking for any damage, any panel damage, any dents, scratches, high spots, low spots. Once I'm happy with that, we're looking at cleaning the panel down, generally using solvent-based panel wipe, a low VOC cleaner, wipe on, wipe off. Then we're looking at technical data sheets to check what abrasive is required to key up the wet on wet primer that we're going to be using later, gun setups, mixing ratios, etc. I've gone for 320 grit onto a DA sander attached to the central extraction system to remove or reduce the dust, and I'm just putting it over the central sections of the panel, trying to avoid the edges and the swage lines. I'm using a interface pad which will help follow the contours. Interface pad is a soft pad in between the abrasive and the backing pad, and you can see I'm trying to avoid the edges, and if you do go onto the edges, you can see in a moment I've gone through to bare metal there on the edge, on the bottom edge. So just do the larger areas using the DA sander and the 320 grit abrasive. And then you use a non-woven abrasive called a Scotch-Brite pad. In our case, because we're preparing for a primer, a foundation material, a red Scotch-Brite is required. And you can see here, over these areas that's looking good, and over these areas here where it's bare metal, it's not ideal. It's not the end of the world. You won't have to put any kind of etched primer on because our surface or our wet on wet primer will have etching properties, and if it's only a small area of bare metal then we'll be fine. Anywhere where you want the paint to adhere, we will Scotch-Brite. Nothing sticks to shiny, nothing sticks to dusty, so we're getting rid of all the shiny material to allow a mechanical bond in between our cathodic primer, or E-coat, which is the black primer you can see in front of you, and this material here, which is our WOW primer, or wet on wet. And a wet on wet primer is a material that doesn't require any kind of flatting down with any abrasives. So I'm on the paint management system now, punching RFU, which is ready for use, RFU master list, and I'm selecting the primer option. I'm double checking the numbers on the tin and it says wet on wet primer. Use the D-pad to select wet on wet. What hardener we're using and the correct thinner we're using as well. And once I'm happy with my hardeners and thinners and the mixing ratio is correct, I put the quantity in. For a single wing like this you only need one wet flowing coat, and I'm going to need around about 100 millilitres. Centralise the pot. 13.6 grams is what the pot weighs, so we need to neutralise that. We click enter and there's our first material. And our first material is our primer. Now that's a solvent based material, so it will need stirring for 20 minutes twice a day. This has already been done, and we are doing a calculation where you see the numbers reducing down to 0, so as close to 0 as you can possibly get. If you do go over, you do have the opportunity to recalculate. So once you get down to this sort of level, and you can see I've gone a fraction over there, 1.6 grams, and it says a little positive sign there. Quite straightforward. It'll give you the option there do you wish to recalculate, and for what it's going to take, it's only going to mix up another gram of material or another 2 or 3 millilitres, so I've accepted that. Move straight on then to our activator, and it's a single panel So I need a relatively quick activator. And it's the same sort of process. I'm going to count these numbers down to 0, so 16.1 grams. Take it nice and easy. Try and get the material into the cup and not all over the scales. And then down to our solvent, our dilutant, or commonly known as thinners. And I'm going to use a universal 2K solvent for this material, for this thinner, and then down to 0 again. I've not included a viscosity check in this, but you can see it on one of the other videos. You can see me doing a viscosity check. The viscosity on this material is around about 20 to 23 seconds, so it's very, very thin. And the technical data also reads you need a 1.6 gun setup. So you've got a very thin material with a relatively large gun setup. So the panel's been blown off with using a duster gun. It's been panel wiped many times using a wipe on, wipe off method. It's in the booth, it's up to 20 degrees, so the ambient temperature of the booth, which is 20 degrees for spray, will be then transferred into the panel. So the panel has to be 20 degrees as well, and that's what it says on the technical data sheet. A quick tat rag of the panel, quick tat rag of the airline, and the pot of the spray gun. Doing my edges first, I've checked my air pressure, which is 2 bar pressure. Do the framework of my panel, so I tend to do all the outside extremities first. And you can look at the relationship between the top of my air cap and the profile of the panel, and you'll notice it'll be 90 degrees at all times following that profile of that wing all the way down. And I'm looking for a lovely reflection. The best way to describe it with wet on wet primer is you get it as wet as you possibly can without it running. It will flow to a glass-like finish. Any imperfections at this stage, as is after I've flashed off, in other words allow the solvents to evaporate, need to be rectified. Wet on wet primer is not really designed to be rectified, unfortunately. However, for minor dirt inclusions you can nib it out with a 1000 grit foam back abrasive, then re-tack, and then apply your first coat of base coat. First coat of base coat. Base coat's been put into a 1.3 setup spray gun, 2 bar pressure, and it's a light but wet coat. You don't want to go too heavy with your first coat of base coat. And the reason for that is if there's any imperfections or if you need to strip that material away, it's very easy to remove that first coat of base coat. However, if you put a relatively heavy coat on, it will take a lot longer to flash off. In other words, the water, because it's a waterborne base coat, to evaporate. But this laid on nice and straightforward. You've got to make sure that you put in the same amount of material in the centre as to the edges and the lower sections. So it's flashed off, fast forwarded 6 minutes at 40 degrees with the blowers on inside the booth, so we've got a lot of air movement and 40 degree heat as well. I'll put a second coat on. And again, look at the profile of my gun in relation to the profile of the wing. All the way to the end, all the way to the end again. Put a nice even coat of material on all the way down. And the same again. It's time to check the opacity. Now I put 2 coats of base coat over the wiped primer. And I just want to check, just to make sure I've got the right amount of coats of material on there. So I put the light wet coat on first, and you can clearly see the checker pattern underneath. So that tells me I need more material. And opacity means the covering power of the paint. And blue is a relatively good covering material, but we don't want any mishaps when we paint the panel, take it out in natural daylight and find out that we've not put enough material on there. We don't want the underlying material, what's called grinning through, and that's what you can see with those checkers. So I've put 2 coats of material on now, allowed it to flash off, and you can see with the sun gun that replicates natural daylight, and you can still see the checkers through, so that tells me that I need another coat on my wing and my test panel. And this is a 3M sun gun. A very good bit of kit, especially if you're working shift patterns. So if you're doing night shift where there is no natural daylight to check your opacity or colour match, then they're a great bit of kit. So a 3rd coat was required to achieve opacity. And it's really important that you apply your paint on the colour check panel as you do on the wing itself. And again, I've gone for my 3rd and final coat. A full flowing coat. I use a 1.3 HVLP spray gun, high volume low pressure spray gun. So it's flashed off now, and it's time for the drop coat. And the drop coat, with this material that we're using, which is a Max Mayer material, Max Mayer base coat, it actually is a very important layer of material that is required for colour matching. If you don't put the drop coat on, you'll find that the base coat will be too dark. And the trick with the drop coat, if you notice, there's not a wet flowing coat. I've put my gun slightly farther away and the application is a lot quicker, which gives you a nice light coat of material that's actually dropping onto the existing base coat. Okay, it's time to mix up the clear coat now. Mixing ratio for this material is 2:1. 2 parts clear coat, 1 part activator. I'm using the SATA RPS cups, Rapid Paint System cups. And a final tack off, and this is an opportunity to check for any imperfections. You can feel any dirt inclusions through your tack rag. And at this point, if you have got any dirt inclusions or any imperfections, this is the time to rectify them. You're not going to rectify them after you've put your clear coat on, because the clear coat will seal in any imperfections. And it felt relatively okay. First coat of clear coat is the light but wet coat. And again, if you go too heavy, your clear coat will almost certainly run. So your first coat is a light but wet coat. Making sure that I get all behind the inner wing and the inner sections of the wing, at the back of the wing as well, because the customer will see that when they open the door. Very important. So a light coat, allow for flash off, and I've allowed around about 5-6 minutes flash off at 20 degrees, and I'm ready for my second coat. If you don't allow the flash off, then you'll trap solvents in between one coat and the first coat and the second coat, and that will result in either runs or solvent boil, or solvent pop as it's commonly known as. And that's where you get micro blisters of material, small trapped areas of solvent that will be seen in the final coat of clear coat once it's been baked. Allowing 5 minutes in between coats eliminates that. It allows it to breathe, allows the solvents to escape,